Hey folks, Chad Perkins for Red Giant. In this tutorial, we're going to look at something called layer maps, which is probably the most powerful and yet underused feature in Trapcode Form. We'll start by explaining layer maps and what they are. Then we'll look at some basics of just how to get started with layer maps. And then I'm going to show you a series of examples, just kind of some breakdowns of different things that you can do with layer maps, just to open your mind to the possibilities. Now, layer maps are found in the form interface here in this layer maps section. Layer maps allow you to use other layers to control the color, alpha, displacement, size, fractal strength, dispersion, and rotation of the form particles. Now, let's look at this example here. I have this little pre-comp with these little dripping little vector shapes here. Kind of pretty. Just a 5-second long composition, but there's a lot of gradients here, a lot of details, and a lot of cool stuff going on. So what I can do over here is I can go to my form here on a different layer, and I'm going to go to layer maps, open up color and alpha, and I'm going to choose the layer. I'm going to choose HD dripping rainbow things is the name of my pre-comp here. And now in the latest versions of After Effects, we can choose to use the source. Or let's say we've applied fractal noise to another layer, and in times past we would have to pre-compose that layer to kind of bake in the fractal noise or whatever effect you're using. And you don't need to do that anymore. You could just choose effects and masks from this drop down. It'll use all of that content. It'll see the fractal noise or whatever effect you've applied. Now we don't have any effects on this pre-comp, so I'm just going to go ahead and click outside of this to accept it. And then we want to adjust the functionality. For right now, I'm okay with RGB to RGB. And nothing's working yet because you need to map this over certain properties. So I need to map this over XY. Before I do that, I'm going to adjust my base form a little bit. I'm going to go to XYZ individual, and I'm going to smash these together in Z a little bit more. So there's just not that much space between them. And I'm also going to increase the size X and Y. So there's a little bit more. I'll probably add some more density to the particles, add more resolution here in just a second. But for now, I'm going to close up base form and come to color and alpha. Now, I haven't adjusted the color at all, but it doesn't matter because if I had my particle color, let's say I'm going to do something, I'll just make it red for right now. Whatever I change it to in the layer maps, if I'm going to use another layer for color and alpha, it's going to completely replace that red with the colors from the other layer. So now I'm going to change color and alpha. I have this layer loaded up, the HD dripping rainbow things. I'm going to map this over XY, which will enable it. And now the red is gone, and now I see these little drips. And again, I'm going to go back to base form, increase the resolution by increasing the particles in X, the particles in Y, and we get more detail here. We can see those gradients from all those particles. And I'll take down size Z, maybe something like 30. So to smash that together. And now if I preview this back, we get those same rainbow drips from that pre-comp, but now our form is doing that. So it really opens up a lot of possibilities of what we can do with Trapcode Form. Now, if I were to click this little transparency grid icon, we'd see a bunch of black dots as well. Now, this is black on black, so we're not really seeing that. But what I would want to do here is change RGB to RGB to RGBA to RGBA. So that way we can actually use the alpha channel that's in the pre-comp, get rid of those black dots, those black particles, and just have this as transparency. I mean, this is a really beautiful effect. The animation carries over. And so now that pre-comp layer is driving both the color and the animation of our form particles. Now, something to keep in mind and something we're going to see throughout this tutorial is that we can still use all of the awesome features of Trapcode Form with this stuff, with layer maps. So I can go to Disperse and Twist, and I could, well, let me close this up so I can see everything here. I can go to Disperse and Twist, and I can twist these particles if I want to. Create some interesting results that way. I can disperse these particles if I want to. So now I have just like a flood of rainbow. That's really interesting. Just these pockets of color that kind of overlap. I could also undo that and add some fractal field. I could displace these if I want to. So you can see that we have a lot of diversity and a lot of options when we're using layer maps. Let me show you another example here. I went in and I animated this a little bit with some text. Same exact thing with the same pre-comp that we were just looking at, the same dripping rainbow stuff, but just animated it in a different way. And what I did with the form here is I applied polar coordinates to it and wrapped those drips around. So now they're kind of dripping outwards instead of dripping from top to bottom. And then I added an adjustment layer with the transform effect and then animated the scale of it so it all scales up and kind of drips. And I also changed the fractal displacement settings so that it's kind of more of a big wave rather than like a little tiny wave. And so we just kind of have this like cool undulating thing that just kind of pops out. I love that. Love the way that looks. And to me, what's really fun about this is this doesn't look like Trapcode Form. This is really unconventional stuff. And a lot of times when you use form in very conventional ways where you're just using fractal displacement or whatever, it has a tendency to maybe feel old a little bit because we've seen that before in different things. So you kind of have to get creative with it. And this is one way you can really get creative and use form for some beautiful effects because of layer maps. Now, let's look at another example here. I have a fence layer, just a fence. But as you can see here, there's some transparency. So I can go to form and I want to go to particle. I'm just going to maybe make this kind of like a fiery orange type color. And I've already kind of adjusted the base form a little bit. I might go back and maybe make this a little bit wider. Maybe go to XYZ individual, do the same thing where we're kind of doing maybe like 1920 by 1080. And then I'm gonna take this down to like 50 and add some more particles here in X and Y, just so we have kind of like a dense grid here. And then I could go to, let me just close all this stuff up here. Then I could go to layer maps, color and alpha. And now what I could do is I could choose the fence from the layer dropdown. And then what I could do, and I'll map this over X and Y, but I actually want to not use the color information. So I don't want to use RGB to RGB. I actually just want the alpha channel of the fence. So then I could just use A to A, alpha to alpha, the alpha of one layer to the alpha of this layer. And now I have this cool three-dimensional fence. So I could turn the layer or the camera on that I've already created, and I could rotate around this, and now we have like this fence made out of form particles. Now you could tell, I'll go ahead and turn on the transparency grid. You can see what's going on here. This is just almost like a three-dimensional fence, three-dimensional holographic fence on transparency. And again, we could go back to form, and again, we can, twist it or whatever we want to do to it, go to the fractal field and displace it. And so we have all this flexibility, and it's almost like we have kind of like a three-dimensional holographic fence because of this alpha channel and because form particles exist in 3D space. Now, one of my favorite things to do with this is to use effects, use some of the great built-in effects that come with After Effects to create some really interesting results with layer maps and form. So for example, I have this thing, I'm just gonna turn this visibility off. I use CC Mr. Mercury, which is, not the most popular of effects. It just makes goo, like 2D goo with some bevel and emboss on it. And so I just did this. I just shot a bunch of goo upwards with CC Mr. Mercury. But the cool thing with that is that particles are born and they die. And with form, we can't really do that. We can't have particles born and die. And so by using a particle system like Particular ideally, but in this case, I just used just a junky old CC Mr. Mercury, and we could hook that up to Trapcode Form and create some really beautiful effects like these swirlies by using the strings. And so the particles come on and they're born and they die, which we usually can't get with form any other way other than by animating opacity or something like that, which just doesn't feel too organic or too real. And this way they grow organically and they disappear organically. And it's really beautiful because it's using CC Mr. Mercury as a color and alpha map. Now here's another example. I'm going to take the visibility off of the form swirlies layer and put on the form smoke layer. And this is using the same exact CC Mr. Mercury, except that I changed the particle settings on this one to use the cloudlet, increase the feather, increase the size, decrease the opacity a lot, just 9, an opacity value of 9. And now we have this kind of very smoky type thing, which looks a lot more like something you would see with Particular and not with form. Now, of course, you probably would want to do something like this with Particular because it is born and it dies just like Particular does, and so that's more suited to the job. But if you're playing around with form and you need it to do this, if you need it to be smoky and to appear and disappear or morph into something that appears and disappears, you do have that flexibility with form because of layer maps. Here's another example. I have this other layer here, which I use the shatter effect, and I animated shatter at the shatter point here. Let me just close this up and I'll open up shatter. And I increased the repetition so the little chunks are a little bit smaller. And I animated the position of force 1. I also took down the radius quite a bit. So I made kind of like a Zorro animation. Creates this Z. And then when I turn on my form particles, you can see that it kind of erodes the form. And it makes it feel like this form is almost like cloth that's being cut up with scissors or something. We have like little shards that fall apart. And really what's happening, all that's happening, is that I'm using that shatter layer as the color and alpha for the layer map of the form. I love the way those tears in the shatter, the way that breaks up, it appears to make the form look like cloth. It looks like we are tearing fabric here. Now, another thing we could do with this is change the base form. So here I have this map of the world, and I tinted it with the tint effect. And then I used it as the color map, the layer maps area, color and alpha, use this for the RGB. And I changed the base form to a sphere. And I only used one sphere layer. If you use multiple spheres layers, you get that kind of like, well, not 26. Let me just do 3 here. Then we have multiple concentric spheres, and I don't want that, just one. But then I have this kind of cool globe rotating around. It feels like, again, like a hologram made out of form particles. And again, we still have access to all of the form features. I could make the size random. I could make the opacity random. I could add some fractal displacement, disperse, all that type of stuff right here with my globe. Now, I'm going to close this up a little bit. I'm going to go down to my layer maps after closing up all this stuff. Open up layer maps. And I could use this map for color and alpha, but I could also use this map, the earth map here, or any other layer, for any one of these properties. So if I wanted to have a map of the size of the particles, I could also use the earth map and use that as a map for the size. So then the water disappears and the continents, and there's some gradients in the continents, so this is probably not the best map to use for this. But you can still see there's just kind of like the difference in the size of particles here, which is interesting. If you want to flip that, there's a handy invert map section. I don't know about you, but I always get my whites and my blacks confused when I'm using things as maps. And so I'm always so grateful to software developers that put an invert map button for me there. But I could flip this now, and now we see the water, and there's some more, there's tinier particles where these continents are. And size is actually a really good workaround for color and alpha because you can't have a separate color and alpha map. Color and alpha are just kind of one thing. So you can kind of cheat it a little bit by using size, because you can use size as your alpha because it kind of makes the particles so small they disappear, and then use a different color map for that way. So now we haven't talked about displacement, fractal strength, disperse, and rotate. Rotate we're not going to look at in this tutorial. We're going to save that to when we talk about custom particles in the next movie in this series. But I do want to talk about displacement, fractal strength, and disperse, and I want to talk about using them all at once. So I'm going to look at another example here. So in this camp, I have this flower from Illustrator, and I have the transparency on here, enabled at the bottom of the comp panel there. And you can see that there is this alpha as part of the Illustrator flower. Now, I also have a gradient, just a simple, actually just a shape layer, just a simple black to white gradient. Notice the kind of like harder edge here, and we're going to use these in just a second. Now, I've created form and a camera and added some basic fractal displacement, fiddled with the base form setting, just stuff that we've already covered in this training series a billion times. And as I play this here, we just have just real simple animation, nothing special at all. But we're going to really customize this by going into our layer maps and again combining these into some interesting things. So I could go into color and alpha, and I actually want to use the color of the form as is. I don't want to change the color. So I can use the AI Flower Illustrator layer, and I'm going to map the functionality of the alpha to alpha. I just want the alpha of the star, and I need to map this over X, Y. So now we're using the transparency of the star, which is kind of cool. And if we had a little bit more resolution and a little bit less fractal displacement, we'd be able to see that star shape a little bit more clearly, but you could already kind of tell that it's using the alpha from the star. Now, I'm going to close up color in alpha and get into something that's very interesting, and that is displacement. Now, in regular form here, we have fractal field displacement and spherical field displacement, but those are based on a fractal and a sphere, respectively. You can't just displace however you want to displace something. But this displacement is unique to layer maps. We can actually displace this in a really unique way. So I actually can change the map over to X, Y. And this isn't how I want to do this, but I'm just going to temporarily set it up this way. I'm going to say the displacement is the flower. And then we have this flower displacement. We can increase the strength. And what this does is that this maps the RGB to XYZ. So this displaces things in all directions. And that's actually not what I want here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change RGB to XYZ to individual XYZ, because most of the time when I'm displacing something, I actually just want to displace it in the Z axis. So, I mean, that might change for you, but for me right now, I want to use just the Z axis. I want to displace this and have this coming out at me. And actually, so we can see this a little bit more clearly, I'm going to temporarily take down displacement to 0, just so we can see this. There we go. So we can now see with a displaced value of 0, nothing's happening, but with as we adjust this displaced value, we can see that the white in the Illustrator file is actually causing these pixels to move forward. Well, depending on how we adjust this value. And so we could really get access to our shape and displace certain pixels in certain areas by using a map like this. And again, just so you can see the difference more clear, I'm going to take this back to RGB to XYZ, and we'll displace this. If I use the flower here, we'll displace this in all dimensions. And that's really not what I want here. So again, I'm going to do individual XYZ and turn off X displacement. I'm just going to use Z displacement and just a little bit in the negative direction for that. So we have this cool displacement to our flower. And maybe that's a little much. I might take that down just a little bit, but you get the idea. Okay, so I'm going to close up displacement. So now we're using a layer map for the alpha channel. We're using a layer map for displacement. And now we could actually use a layer map for, well, anything if we want, actually. But I'm actually going to use a layer map for dispersion. I just want the kind of edges to be dispersed here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the layer to the gradient. And I'm going to map this over X and Y. Now, disperse is actually kind of interesting because if you just set a map to disperse the particles, nothing will happen if you don't have any disperse value. So I need to come down here to disperse and twist, bump up the disperse value, and now we're seeing these particles be dispersed because of our gradient map. Now, if we were to go back to our shape layer and let's say open up, I'm going to type UU to get access to the things that we've changed, including the gradient. I could edit the gradient. And if I were to move these color stops around, change how they gradually go from one point to another, or make a more abrupt change, then we start to see that reflected in the map right here, which is, really cool. I'm going to go ahead and get that to a happy place and go ahead and click OK. I'm going to go back to my form settings. Now I want to bring back that fractal displacement, so I'm going to open up fractal field, take our displaced value to about 150. I think that's where we were. And this doesn't work. I just kind of want displacement to be at the ends. I could use a gradient for that. I could use a layer map to customize where I want that. But I could also use the curves in addition to what I have going on here with the layer maps. So I'm going to make sure the fractal strength is set to radial because I want this to be, again, out from the center. And I don't want there to be any fractal displacement in the center. So I'm going to mow the lawn right here. And then bring this up, and I'll smooth that a few times, and maybe actually bring that back in a little bit. So there's a little bit on the edges, maybe even a little bit more on the edges. And now I could smooth that out. And so we have dispersion at the ends of our flower, and we also have a little bit of fractal field displacement at the ends of our flower. We have displacement in the center. So you can use layer maps for multiple properties. You can use curves for those properties in addition to layer maps. And really the point here is to get the most out of form by using layer maps. So I really challenge you to experiment and explore the possibilities here. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Shout out to Pond5 for all the super dope music I used in this tutorial.